Hi, folks, and welcome to week 5 on testimonies and media literacy. I'm actually going to be discussing media literacy first, then get into testimonies, as seen here in this list of learning objectives. So let's begin. I want to start with the observation that we live in what one Dutch theorist, writing about Holocaust testimony in the digital age, calls the era of the user. This refers to a global internet culture that emphasizes user generated content, which may have sounded great in theory, but despite the promise of the digital revolution and democratizing the public sphere, I think we all know the dismal reality of online content these days. Here we see a couple of examples of what this era of the user has brought us, picking up again on how Holocaust memory is so widely misappropriated and distorted. On the left is an example of disinformation, which is a deliberate falsehood intended to mislead, whereas the image on the right is an example of misinformation, which can either be false or semi-true, but which lacks the explicit intent to deceive. The difference between the two is a matter of intent. So we've learned to live in a digital world where it's unclear what's real, what's fake. For example, here's a meme that the fact-checking website Snopes says originated in 2013, and which misattributes a quote to Anne Frank about regret being stronger than gratitude. It's a beautiful quote, on the surface at least, but there's absolutely no evidence that Anne Frank ever said this. It's entirely absent in her autobiography. And yet this meme continues to circulate even today, because people don't know whether it's true or not. And it sounds true, or it feels true, or whatever. This is what's called the liar's dividend, which is a term that was originally conceived to explain the risk of deepfakes, a recent technology that produces hyper-realistic digital impersonations. These deepfakes spread through a world of epistemic uncertainty, where users don't know what's real and what's not. The same idea has also been described as a post-truth era, in which public truth claims are influenced less by objective facts than by raw, unchecked emotions and/or prior beliefs. Post-truth politics is a critical problem that affects us all, not just young people. Now, thankfully, a number of states are starting to mandate K-12 media literacy education, although to be honest, this is something that we could all benefit from, especially older generations who weren't raised as so-called digital natives. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide here, which basically digests content from reading 4. So rather than go through these core concepts one by one, I want you all to think about why I might have assigned this reading, even though it has nothing to do with genocide education, at least not on the surface. What does a media literacy education have to do with what we're talking about? Here I have an exercise that makes that very connection. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce to you the USC Shoah Foundation's Eyewitness website. I'll talk more about the USC Shoah Foundation later on, but I encourage you to go to their website, set up your own free account. Once you log in, it'll bring you to this main page. If you go over to the toolbar menu on the left, click on the Activities icon, it'll bring you here. Under the Activities page, they've provided a ton of off-the-shelf exercises that teachers can use in the classroom. There's nearly 600 of them. They're arranged into different categories, and as you can see through these various examples, a lot of them are Holocaust-centric, including this one, on using media literacy skills to examine the Holocaust. Now, for those of you up for it, I'd like you to complete this activity and report back to us. What kind of content have they prepared for us? And how is the activity structured? Eyewitness is a really useful resource, and from what I understand, teachers love it. But what do you all think? Okay, the next few slides come from my doctoral research methods and writing seminar, where I also use Reading 1 to provide a methodological analysis of testimonies in Holocaust and genocide studies. The following content provides some theoretical background for exploring the ramifications of using Holocaust testimonies as a template for remembering other genocides. This starts with some basic principles of memory, the process of which begins with the transformation of perceptual stimuli into a neurological memory code. And this part of the process is selective. Right, so not everything you experience perceptually gets selected for encoding, because the amount of attention you have is limited. This part of the process is also elaborative, meaning that we encode into memory not what is actually happening, but what we interpret or perceive to be happening. The second stage is storage, which itself is broken down into substages, starting with immediate brief sensory registers, lasting a few seconds, to short-term memory and long-term memory. In a moment, I'll talk about how trauma interferes with this normal, linear sense of time. The final stage is retrieval, although this is a bit more complicated, as memory is not a thing per se. Right? It's not like recording a video and storing it in an archive for future retrieval, like plucking a cassette tape off the shelf or something. Instead, memory recall involves reconstructing the past with the help of inferential reasoning. So you remember some key details of an event, and your brain basically fills in the rest. So, a key principle of memory is that it is constructed. We selectively remember the past to meet some present or future need. This means that our memories are fundamentally subjective. Intuitively, we all know that memory is fallible, subject to error, and not in any way objective vessels of historical meaning. It's kind of common sense. Our memories are unreliable, subjective, misleading. And there are any number of legal cases involving lying witnesses and wrongful convictions based on false or inaccurate witness testimony. Lawyers have a number of different ways of detecting eyewitness error. So, was the witness in a position to accurately observe the events in question? Did they see it firsthand? In a courtroom, they'd ask a witness how close or far they were from the incident. Was the light good? Were they wearing their glasses? Now, we'd never be so uncouth as to ask whether or not a survivor was wearing their glasses, so that's not what I'm saying. I'm just referring to a common line of questioning in the courtroom to make a point about the fallibility of memory. Another source of eyewitness error is the witness's state of mind. And this is especially pertinent for genocide testimonies. Obviously, trauma affects how people remember the past, and plus, people just misremember things. Like I said before, human memory does not work like a video recorder or a movie camera, and that when we want to remember something, we don't go and pluck the memory out of the memory store. As we saw on the previous slide, memory is constructed from stored and available bits of information, and any gaps in information are filled in unconsciously by inferences, which are naturally another source of error. It happens all the time, in fact. And finally, and most simply, the eyewitness may just be lying, although there's never a simple binary between truth and lies. I expand upon this point in my research methods class, where we read a Christopher Browning essay about the various tests historians should use when investigating the post-war testimonies of Adolf Eichmann specifically, and perpetrator sources more generally. I'll skip over this for now, but if you download this PowerPoint from Canvas and open up the notes section on the slide, you'll find some extra content, a lot of which is just raw research notes. But the point of this slide is really about the fallibility of testimonies, which is also the point of this slide, i.e. the veracity or accuracy of testimonies, which is all the more complicated when it comes to traumatic memories. Again, go to my notes for more details. All I'll say is that trauma clearly interferes with the normal, historically grounded, and chronologically charted memory that we're familiar with, and which is fairly straightforward, right? Like first this happened, then this, then that, so on and so forth. As we'll see, organizations that record testimonies often favor this type of easily accessible memory that seemingly enables a sense of closure. For students as well, this type of narration is easy to follow and digest, especially when they're looking for mostly factual information. Yet the desire for rationally ordered survivor testimonies is often interrupted by traumatic memories, which are often repressed, kept buried down as an unresolved trauma that lies beyond the reach of meaning. To the extent that deep memory is defined by trauma, it is not necessarily veridical. Right? So students can't exactly go to these deep traumatic memories to retrieve historical facts. So in my doctoral methods class, we talk about this particular case of a Holocaust testimony that misremembered an important historical detail. And basically the point here is that you don't necessarily go to survivor testimonies in search of historical truths, i.e., the nuts and bolts of history, the precise facts and figures that are required for an empirical reconstruction of the past. And that's not necessarily the point of testimonies, which often work on a deeper level of so-called narrative truths, which involve a subject trying to make coherent sense of a traumatic past in order to achieve some degree of closure. These traumatic memories may not be empirically accurate in the sense of corresponding with what, quote, really happened, but they nevertheless represent actual lived experiences. Just because they may be empirically inaccurate makes them no less true. These alternative meanings are inherent to the keyword truth, the primary meaning of which is in accordance with fact or reality, reflecting the world or state of things as they actually exist. Yet this connotation is etymologically pretty modern, and if we unpack the etymology and historical semantics of the word, the original meaning of the keyword truth was being characterized in good faith, as in being authentic, true to oneself, genuinely felt. Right? So there are different meanings to the keyword truth, and different ways of dealing with this dilemma of survivor testimonies. On the one hand, we can treat testimonies in quasi-spiritual or sacred terms affording them the utmost respect and reverence, so that whatever they say is the quote unquote truth. Now, we don't necessarily have to go that far by granting survivor testimonies a certain degree of deference, so that we should by default accept the veracity of survivor testimonies until we find persuasive arguments to the contrary. On the other hand, we can also use survivor testimonies in more instrumental terms, providing micro-level data that can be mined by researchers for various illustrative means, of which Saul Friedlander is a really good example. Other scholars don't even use testimonies because they're sometimes riddled with errors, as we saw in the previous slide. Our old friend from week 2, Lucy Davidovitz, is actually an example of this. There is, of course, a middle ground, which is about using the subjective authenticity of testimonies to supply meaning, not strictly in terms of facts per se, but in terms of exploring the depths of human experiences during genocide. Okay, and this finally gets us to reading 1, which includes a section entitled Divergent Cultures of Testimony, the gist of which you see here. I won't add much apart from the fact that the Tudelman Library here at Gratz also includes one of the earliest collections of oral history testimonies. Anyways, we're especially interested in the USC Shoah Foundation, which houses the aforementioned eyewitness platform. The Shoah Foundation originated with Steven Spielberg's famous movie Schindler's List, and it's developed practices that shape testimonial accounts into coherent and accessible narrative segments that implicitly follow a dramaturgical or cinematic-like storytelling structure, with a coherent beginning, middle, and end. For students, this type of conventional narrative structure is easy to follow and digest. And like I said before, this type of conventional narrative structure is easy for students to follow and digest. What I'd like to discuss is how this logic gets imported to the repository's collection of quote-unquote other genocides. So for example, reading 1 talks about the collaboration between the Shoah Foundation and DC CAM, which documents the Cambodian genocide. What are the implications of this relationship, especially as they pertain to previous discussions we've had about the Holocaust prototype and the genocide studies canon? The institutional analysis from reading 1 actually sets up nicely reading 3, which is the topic here. The author of Reading 3 previously worked as the research director for the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's Committee of Conscience, which was part of the museum's original mandate. Back in 1979, President Carter's Commission on the Holocaust. Call that from week 2. This part of the museum's mission is to use Holocaust memory to stimulate action for genocide prevention. So the author opens with a reflection on this exhibit she helped produce. Think about how the exhibit is organized and arranged spatially, leading from Holocaust memory to an interactive exhibit space, featuring eyewitness video testimonies from other quote-unquote major cases of genocide. So not only the content, but the structure of the exhibit is reproducing the Holocaust-centric formation of the genocide studies canon, with a conceptual map of the field that I referenced in week 1. My notion from that week of the foreign gaze is also relevant to this extended quote from reading 2. Quote, "The challenge is to understand where one is in relation to the threat of genocide. It is here with us now, of course, but we are not at risk. That's debatable. Is it possible to introduce the reality of genocide in our time while asking visitors or the general public, let alone the quote experts, to recognize as well their distance from it?" End quote. Now, I mostly agree with this incisive statement, although some of us are more distant from the problem of genocide than others. Remember where we started in week 1. This problem cuts closer to the home than we'd like to think. This stream of conscious type essay goes on to share some accounts about eyewitnesses and survivors of genocide, including some photojournalists. The analysis on this page here is especially pertinent for next week when we discuss images, films, and fictions. What do we do with the shocking imagery we so naturally associate with the genocidal imaginary? Back in week 3, we talked about providing guardrails for students confronting difficult knowledge, safely in, safely out. But that argument is absent here. It's just the opposite, which is that the searing and shocking imagery of others' suffering has the power to, quote, reveal the innate humanity of their subjects. I guess it's really a matter of age appropriateness. At what age are viewers/learners ready to face the more difficult aspects of difficult knowledge? Okay, one last point about this reading, which speaks to the learning objective about positionality, as in our own positionality in relation to the problem of genocide. There's a difference between us outsiders looking in, i.e. those of us who thankfully don't know what genocide is really about, and those insiders looking out, i.e. those survivors who know all too well. The author shares 2 fascinating anecdotes about insiders and outsiders. The first quote was what a photographer, presumably a Westerner and an outsider, said to a Bosnian survivor slash insider standing before his father's grave at the memorial site for Srebrenica. I guess it was during some event or whatever, and the poor guy was just standing in the way. And the second quote is from the opposite perspective. The author, an outsider, is talking about her experience reaching out to a Rwandan civil society organization run by and for survivors, i.e., insiders. And this response is what she got. What do you want from us? We see this same insider outsider dynamic in reading too, which considers many key questions, ethical problems, and epistemological challenges facing the various stakeholders in the field, including both teachers and students in schools, as well as survivors. This reading is based on what the authors self describe as a participatory action research project and community led curriculum development for a groundbreaking grade 11 World Studies course in genocide education. This involved gathering, systematizing, and analyzing diverse forms of knowledge and collective memory within Rwandan Canadian communities. Pretty cool stuff. Take note of these core values from the author's introduction, where they identify themselves as feminist educators committed to a collaborative research design as a process of knowledge production. Each of the three authors take turns responding to the same set of prompts. The first author is a second-generation survivor, and she makes a really important point about how the, quote, testifier is often implicitly distinguished from the, quote, expert. Like we saw in the last slide, there's a whole cottage industry of outsiders who see themselves as experts, and this outside-inside dynamic echoes a colonial economy of knowledge. More positively, she and the next author worked together on a documentary that took a different approach to telling survivor stories not simply as victims, but as educators as well. Second author is a community-based researcher, mentor, and activist. Now, I can't tell whether she's a first or second generation survivor, but it doesn't really matter, considering her opening point about insider practices of survivors sharing stories about atrocities. These private, inward-facing memory activities are different from the outward-facing presentations given to North American audiences, students and adults who basically know nothing about the context, and who often end up seeing survivors like her as objects. And she introduces the theme of listening as a key potential for the productive, ethical use of testimony. The third author's background is actually rooted in the Austrian bystanders during the Holocaust, although she also notes her implicated status in settler colonial North America. If the other two authors are very much insiders, this last author is very much an outsider. She's very self-reflective of the fact that genocide is something distinctly foreign to her. Again, recall the foreign gaze. Her thoughts on the productive, ethical use of testimony pick up on some familiar themes we've seen already, such as difficult knowledge. She offers some clever ways for rethinking some possible dead-end questions. Okay, and that's it. We have our usual discussion form assignment, and you should be making some headway on your final project. Reach out to me to discuss. Anyways, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.